my loves, and welcome back to the Fluffenhammer Adjacent. I'm currently, thanks to my colleague Andy Millman, who has sold me a hell of a lot of Death Guard for a very, very reasonable price. And when I say a hell of a lot, I mean like Plague Marines, Pox Walkers, Blight Lord Terminators, sorcerers in Terminator armor, Lord Felthius and his cohort, Typhus, a malignant plague caster, a biologus putrefier, the death god icon bearer, the plague surgeon, plague burst crawlers, all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's a huge, huge set of miniatures that he's sold me, and I am very, very pleased indeed. I've been a fan of the Death Guard for the longest time. I mean, even before I collected Chaos, I liked the Death Guard. My original army for 40k was the Eldar, as they were way back when, the Eldari as they are now. My first codex, the first book I bought that really taught me so much about the universe of 40k was the Second Ed Eldar Codex, which was really early in that particular era. That book, I mean, I don't have it anymore, but it fell apart basically. I read it so much that it fell apart. I still have a massive soft spot for the Eldari, by the way. I do love my space elves. I like them a hell of a lot. But the Death Guard, the followers of Nurgle, particularly in 40k, fascinated me even back then. And with the advent of the second edition Chaos Space Marine Codex, they got this incredible revamp. They're one of the. It was really hodgepodge, that release. Some factions got loads of attention and some did not. So Thorn had a reasonable amount of attention. Nurgle had a reasonable amount of attention. Zeech didn't get any. Back then, what became the Rubric Marines didn't have a release at all. You had to you had to convert them yourself from like whatever you had lying around, and they weren't very good anyway. They were pretty terrible on the tabletop, let's be honest. The only reason you took them back then was there was this really weird rule where the demons of a chaos power were anchored to the battlefield by units that had the relevant mark of chaos. So the only reason you would take Thousand Sons back then was to anchor like a Lord of Change or a unit of Pink Horrors or Flamers or something like that. They were not very good at all. They didn't get any attention. It was a real shame. But the Death Guard got loads. The Death Guard had a very awful plastic Plague Marine set, which were all just just completely identical miniatures. And they also had lots of metal miniatures too. And the metal miniatures is where it was at, quite frankly. They had this really interesting revamp where they introduced, for some reason, elements that have become iconic since then. They looked at certain World War One and World War Two uniforms for them. So they got certain motifs that were relevant of certain uniforms and bits of armor from those conflicts. Very, very strange indeed. They got the iconic rebreathers then, for example, which are obviously like World War One gas masks, right? Their helmets were fashioned in a particular way to be redolent of the German side of World War One. Very peculiar, very strange indeed. But I kind of loved those miniatures. They were really, really interesting, and I had loads of them. I had an absolute ton of them. Back then, I actually had a Death Guard army, and they were quite good. I mean, toughness 5 Marines was pretty baller back then. That was very unusual and made them very, very tough indeed. Um, but one of the things, I mean, and since then, really, I've kept up with them. I had a Death Guard army for third ed. Loved my Death Guard in third ed, particularly when the 3.5 Codex came out. Loved them, loved them, loved them. I've branched out since then into, I mean, the Emperor's Children. I absolutely love. They're probably my favorites because, you know, Slanesh is my favorite Chaos power. My Thousand Sons, obviously. Space Wizards. How can you not love them? They're absolutely brilliant. But thanks to Andy, I've now started collecting Death Guard in 10th Ed. This is the first time I've touched them for quite a while, and they've got me really excited. I've got to say, the miniatures range for a start, the current miniatures range. I know some people don't, they're not really the aesthetic that they like because they are very overwrought. They're sort of laden with detail. Every like troop of a Death Guard army has as much attention in terms of the sculpt as characters from other armies. Every single one of them is unique. I love that. I think that suits Chaos down to the ground. My favorite Chaos miniatures are those that are so warp touch they're almost impossible to discern in terms of what they used to be. But what is it? I mean, what is it about the Death Guard that's so appealing? Because they are one of the most popular miniatures ranges out there. People love the Death Guard. If you go onto any of the 40k forums and go down to the modeling section, you will find hundreds of threads of people doing Death Guard, and I think that's part of it. For it, I mean, purely aesthetically and practically, if you want to paint them, they're really easy. They don't suit a neat painting style. I really appreciate when people go to town with incredible skill and finesse with paint schemes. But do you know that doesn't suit Death Guard at all? When you've got a Death Guard miniature army that's too clean, it doesn't look right. Where everything is meticulous, it just doesn't look right. They suit really down and dirty painting styles, loads of dry brushing, loads of stippling, kind of dirty paint schemes. That's how they look best, like orcs. Orcs are like this. They just suit that down to the ground. So, as a starting army, for people who are just starting out, they're actually really good because you can learn to paint with them and still make them look really, really cool. In terms of modeling, that's true as well. You don't need a great. I mean, I sculpt shit all over my Plague Marines. My Death Guard, they're called the Joy Bringers, and their entire shtick is that they're infested with semi-demonic worms from Nurgle's garden that whisper secrets to them and so on and so forth. And they genuinely believe that they are like the heralds of some new age, of like some new utopian age. They bring the worms as parasites to imperial settlements and infect their foodstuffs and their water supplies and whatnot. And they believe they're doing the right thing. They believe that they're bringing joy to the downtrodden and revelation to the ignorant and all that kind of thing. So all I have to do to make my miniatures unique is sculpt little worms on them, and that's really easy, and it looks really, really good. Oh, and you can sculpt boils and tumors; those are very easy to sculpt. They're very forgiving in that regard. You can do an awful lot with them, and there's just so much scope. There's so much scope for the modeler and for the hobbyist that you can sculpt all sorts on them: bloated bellies bursting through armor, tumors, worms, parasites, slug-like bodies, fly-like heads. I mean, it's just endless. It really is for the converter, and I like converting my miniatures. I find that really fun. And for the storyteller, for the person who wants to sort of tell a story through their army, there is nothing like them. They're almost unique in that regard. But also for me, there's something about the extremity of them. There's the background, which I just find wonderful. I think 40k is at its best, at its absolute best, when it just goes balls to the wall, when it doesn't try to take itself too seriously, and it just goes for the absurd. It's why I like most of the more extreme armies. I like the Drukhari, I like the Homunculi, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Word Bearers, Night Lords. It's what attracts me to the Chaos Forces because they represent the central satire of the universe so beautifully. That's inherent to Grimdark. If it gets self-conscious or if it starts to try and take itself too seriously, then it dies. That it doesn't need to. You don't need to explain over much. That's why Chaos is so cool, really, in general, not just Nurgle, but Chaos in general, because it gives you an out. It gives you a mythological and narrative out. They don't abide by any laws or strictures with regards to physical reality. So you can do what you like. You can go as far as you like. And I find that, I mean, the writer in me finds that fascinating. What is it like for these guys? What do they feel? What do they experience internally as they're like walking along in this state of absolute and utter disgrace beyond any hell, any religion, or any human being has ever imagined? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? I love that. And then you mingle that with Nurgle's weirder aspects. The fact that he twists the perceptions of these guys so that they believe they are beautiful, or they believe that they are bringing truth to people, or they actually take joy in the fact that they're so diseased and cancerous and leprous. I mean, that I find so fascinating. I love that to absolute bits. That, I mean, from a mythological perspective, from a storytelling perspective, That's it for me. I know there are variations. So, like, one of the wonderful things that's happened with the Death Guard, as they've got their own codices and they've expanded, there are so many different subcults and factions of them now. So, there are those who believe, as I've just said, that they are beautiful and they're truthful and they're bringing salvation and wonder and beauty to the universe. That's my lot, that's the Joybringers. But there are others as well. There are other factions who are bitter and cynical and hate what they are, but believe that by bringing the rest of the universe down to their level, they'll find some grim satisfaction, or they'll be able to at least cope with what they are. Or they do accept the truth of Nurgle, but they don't celebrate it. They think that it is the truth, but it's an awful truth, you know? That's brilliant too. I love that to absolute bits. Then there are those that are feverish and deluded, their brains are infected and rotted, and they believe they're not seeing what everyone else is seeing. They're a bit like the flesh eater courts in AOS. All of that stuff is true. I love that to absolute frigging bits. I think it's wonderful that the fact there's so much variation in one very particular and extreme faction. That's what makes them so interesting. I just can't get enough of it. They're so disturbing and grotesque, and yet they also exhibit a perverse strain of beauty. They see beauty in themselves, a lot of them do anyway. Their perceptions are twisted such that they have a utopian bent. If they could bring their vision of utopia to the entire universe and turn all of the realms of mankind into miniature gardens of Nurgle, that wouldn't necessarily be an awful thing, because then Nurgle's aspects would take hold, people's perceptions would twist, and they would start to see truth and beauty in what is absolutely repulsive and awful. It would become the new zeitgeist of truth, the new parameter of truth and beauty, if you like. The assumptions of what those things mean would change. And there's something really disturbing about that, really disturbing, that in the 40k universe, it's the worst of the worst bad guys who have the utopian visions for tomorrow, whereas the Imperium doesn't. The Imperium, which by the way, they're not the good guys. They are the worst fascists in imagination. Even the ones you really like, the ones who are advertised as being like the most civilized or the most humane. Look at the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines technically are one of the more civilized and human space marine chapters, but they've still committed genocides, the like of which makes those committed by Hitler and Stalin and Mao combined seem like small potatoes. The same is true of the Salamanders and the Custodes and everyone else who serves the Imperium. It is it's fascism taken to a ridiculous, grimdark, dystopian extreme, and they don't have any vision of tomorrow. They don't have any notion of what tomorrow is going to be. They only have what is now. That's the whole thing about the Imperium of Man. It sustains and it enshrines its own stasis as though that is holy. So there is no vision of tomorrow at all. Maybe Robite has one, but there's no way he's going to ever, he's never going to manifest it. It's never going to work. Maybe Belisarius Cawl has one, but that's never going to work either. But you look at the Death Guard, you look at Fabius Bile, you look at Ahriman. All of them have a vision of what tomorrow is going to be. Okay, they may be deluded, they may be fighting against the tide, but at least they're trying. At least they're trying something. And in that regard, there's something really perverse and attractive about them. I mean, Nurgle's creed is one of those amongst the Chaos powers that is distressingly attractive. You can see why. It's why people fall into it, right? Even though it's ostensibly the most hideous thing imaginable. Slanesh's creed is easy. People just fall into that by accident. The same is true of Zeech and Khorne, to be honest. A moment of anger with Khorne and you're done. It can take you. Khorne has his claws into you at that point. A moment of hoping for things to be different, hoping for things to be better, and that's it. Zeech has got you. And any hint of satisfaction or joy or pleasure or interest that you have in something, and Slanesh has you. With Nurgle, it's a number of things. One of them is despair. The core of Nurgle is despair. That's where his aspects derive from. But it's very complex, because if he were just a god of despair, then he would burn out very quickly, wouldn't he? Just by his very nature, all of his followers would be um, they would indolent and uncaring and diffident, and they would just lie down and die, right? They wouldn't be active like Nurgle's followers are. It's not just despair. It's the ability to look at despair, look at the like rock bottom, beyond rock bottom, and say, "Fuck that. It doesn't matter." And even if it is the truth, I'm going to continue. I'm going to go on doggedly out of some sense of either irony. That's another thing the Death Guard have. Some factions, they have a sense of humor. They think that the state, their own condition, and the state of the universe is grimly funny, because if that's the truth, that in the face of everything, in the face of civilization, all of these alien races striving to create and maintain their own empires, it's all going to collapse anyway. Entropy is ultimate and undeniable, and it's going to collapse anyway. And that's what's funny. That's what's so amusing to them. They are like the manifestation of an existential joke, and it's really cool. That's really cool. I love the way they're portrayed in the fiction. If you've ever read Lords of Silence by Chris Wright. It captures a certain aspect of the Death Guard so beautifully. Wright is one of those Black Library writers who just gets them. He understands how they work on a very intimate level. And I love that. I would heartily recommend that. I would love to see more, though. I'm very surprised there isn't more Black Library fiction focusing on the Death Guard, because they're so much fun to write. They're so much fun to write. And to play with and to create armies from. There is something very intriguing and compelling about them that you just can't really put down. Ironically, they are like that saw that you can't stop scratching, or the scab you can't stop picking. They're very much the manifestation of that. And I love that you have this absurdly extreme expression in the hobby. It's kind of wonderful.